This video is the beginning of the section on Plato. Plato is the one I fell in love with that got me involved in Greek civilization. It was in order to understand Plato that I went back and tried to understand tragedy and Homer, and it was all originally motivated by simply trying to understand what Plato was up to. And I also, actually, the philosophy course that got me into philosophy was philosophy of art, and my mother taught art history. And she took us to Europe when I was a kid, when I was third grade, seventh grade, and then I went again when I was 20. But my mother was a rather quiet person, and when we went to Europe, she just got so excited when we went to the cathedrals. And so I really wanted to know what makes great art great. Why is it that that's great? What's great about it? And these were one of the questions. These were the questions that kind of were in the back of my mind growing up. And I learned philosophy through art. I started out just looking at the visual art or architecture or literature, and gradually I was led into a worldview. That was my natural tendency, was to go from there to some sort of view of the universe. But when I went to college, I was looking around. I had sophomore slump. I could not figure out what mattered to me. And then I took philosophy of art, and the third week we read Longinus on the Sublime, and there's a definite quote that I just stuck in my mind, and when I read that quote I knew this is what I want to do with my life. It wasn't, I had forgotten though that this quote actually specifically referred to Plato, because I just thought of it in a more general way. So I think I'll start out with this quote because I'm going to give this lecture as if I were Plato, because Plato has just captured my imagination. Socrates and Plato, I just can't study them anymore without imagining being Plato or Aristotle. I spent 7 summers in Athens writing, and I spent a sabbatical writing, and the whole time I was writing I was putting myself in the position of the Athenians and Plato and thinking about, well, what was life like? What was it like to walk around Athens and see all these sights and constantly be reminded of what they represented? And so that's what I'm going to do. This lecture also really refers to a lot of the archaeological sites. And I cannot figure out how to get my slides onto a video and make it look professional. So if I figure that out, I'll have another video with my slides on it. But for now, it's just, you have to imagine it. You have to take it in your mind. And you can go online and find a picture, but you really should go there. And then also, you really need to think about what Plato was thinking about, or try to figure out the worldview underneath all of this stuff. So, let me start out with the quote from Longinus. "What was it they saw, those godlike writers who in their work aim at what is greatest and overlook precision in every detail? This, among other things, that nature judged human beings to be no lowly or ignoble creature when she brought us into this life and into the whole universe as into a great celebration, to be spectators of her whole performance and most ambitious actors. She implanted at once into our souls an invincible love for all that is great and more divine than ourselves. That is why the whole universe gives insufficient scope to human beings' power of contemplation and reflection, But our thoughts often pass beyond the boundaries of the surrounding world. Anyone who looks at life in all its aspects will see how far the remarkable, the great, and the beautiful predominate in all things, and he will soon understand to what end we have been born. That is why, somehow, we are by nature led to marvel, not indeed at little streams, clear and useful though they be, but at the Nile, the Danube, or the Rhine, and still more at the ocean. So I think I'm trying to understand what was it that Plato saw that led him to create his own modification of tragedy. And I'll explain what I think his writing style is, what his dialogues are about, how they compare and contrast with tragedy and Homer in future videos. But this one is Plato is talking. He's saying, all right, I have a universal view of the human condition, of a just and unjust society, of good and evil. And so I don't really mean to be ethnocentric. I don't want to be a cultural bigot. I don't want to think my culture was superior because, of course, that's a very corrupting influence. But there were certain aspects to my culture that I loved and I believed in deeply, and I appreciated so much what the people who came before us had created and passed down to us. And that's why I was so appalled when we corrupted the great gift of a free and open society that was handed to us, and we destroyed it. But first I want to explain what that great gift was. Solon was one of my relatives, and he wrote the Constitution of Athens, but there was a long tradition before that of concerns about justice and legal systems. And even in Homer, you have an ecclesia of citizens who deliberate about public affairs, both in Troy and among the Achaeans. So there was obviously a lot of discussion going on in the city-states about how to create a city-state that is self-sufficient or self-governing. But Solon observed how often the possibility of developing thriving city-states was destroyed by the struggle and animosity between the rich and the poor. And as long as there was no communication or no compromise and no willingness to create a middle class, either the rich got the upper hand or the poor got the upper hand, and in both cases the city was not able to flourish. Everybody suffered, really. And the goal of life is to have a society where as many citizens as possible flourish to the highest level possible. They exercise their powers of soul, their creativity, their scientific powers, and ultimately their wisdom. So all of those powers represented by the deities of Greek myth, the stories of Greek myth are trying to get people to avoid doing the things that undermine those powers or pervert those powers, and to use them in a way that enables everyone to flourish, so that authority is always used for the well-being of the people over whom someone has it, so that parents and children and teachers and students and rulers and ruled, employers, employees, everybody wants to rule for the ruled, and also is educated and savvy and competent and able to be able to achieve that goal. So Solon tried to create a body of laws, a constitution that would weave together the rich and the poor, This is what Aristotle called the number one criteria for statescraft, is that you can weave together the rich and the poor. You can create a constitution that will constantly encourage this interaction and the formation and preservation of a thriving middle class. Because you can't have thriving people if you don't have a thriving middle class. And we were also focused on making the transition from just tribalism, biological association, to the village, association based on economics and survival, and then political association, living for the sake of the good life, and cultivating all of those higher order, reflective, creative, scientific, intellectual activities, and building a really healthy community. So, our society was a standout in a lot of ways for its political genius. We had many different institutions and habits, and our society was structured in a lot of ways to create a community of citizens who thought of themselves as citizens, not just as sisters, brothers, personal friends, whatever, but they had this level of consciousness of relating to people you don't know personally, but who are fellow citizens under a common body of laws. And of course, Homer and tragedy are also about hospitality. So the relationship between city-states based on a common body of agreements, such as hospitality agreements, the agreement to be honest and trustworthy. So, so we tried, our founders, our founding fathers, our predecessors, tried to create a system of laws and institutions that would promote moderation. People would want to live moderately. That in turn would lead to a thriving middle class. A criminal justice system, we wanted one that the citizens would have the opportunity to act as jurors. So they would cultivate this capacity for creating good laws. They would participate in the lawmaking process. They would also participate in applying the laws, which is the judiciary, and acting as jurors. And then they would participate in the enforcement of the laws. So basically you have a body of citizens that governs themselves. They don't need any sort of authority figures who exercise power over them and who never have to give it up. So it's as equal as possible. Try to equalize people in their capacity to rule and be ruled. Now, the capacity is difficult. Practical wisdom is obviously difficult. So certain government leaders are elected by the people and others are appointed because people, hopefully, that have good judgment know how to appoint other people who have good judgment. So we wanted to cultivate a commitment to the art of diplomacy, to being able to create just treaties, and also to stick to your treaties, but to have enough of an intelligence community to know if another city-state is lying or being dishonest. We wanted an educational system that would provide opportunity for citizens to develop their various talents and use them for the benefit of everyone. We wanted especially to reward people who think clearly about what they need to do to promote the common good. And then we would promote people based on merit. If people show that they're good at creating laws or applying them, or just living in a way that promotes the common good, that they're good role models, that they would actually get the power. They would be put in positions where they are role models, where they do have the power to create laws and enforce laws, where they would be the ones that get elected as president. Okay, then the other side of this, we have formal institutions, but also there's the informal system of education that promotes a public conscience, and that people really do emotionally love the common good. And this is where the theater and tragedies were emotional education. They were trying to influence the character of people, so that when the critical moment came, people had a strong enough character that they would act well at that critical moment. And also, some of those critical moments are who to vote for, or how to vote in the assembly on certain issues of public policy, or how to make judgments about citizens that do come before the courts. Okay, so here are all the different. We had so many different institutions, habits, and I loved it. I loved the ideas behind it. I loved the legacy I was given. So what was it? Well, obviously the Parthenon. So we have the Acropolis, and at the top of the Acropolis is the temple to Athena, the goddess of justice. She's also the goddess of war, but it's always just war. She's always arguing against Ares, who only loves war, aggression for its own sake. Athena, no way, Jose. Okay. Let's see. The temple to Athena also has the roof of the temple is a very triangle, that the shape of the triangle is the same as the shape of the hills out around Athens. And that was very deliberate, because the message of the architecture is that culture fits into nature. So the temple is, on the one hand, it's physically the highest. It's the highest spot in the city, but the line of the temple at the roof repeats the line of the hills around it. So the message is that human beings, on the one hand, they, at the level of the earth, they have to eat, and they eat the fruit of the earth just like other animals. But when you're going up to the temple of Athena, you slowly walk up the steps. The steps are very broad because this is a slow walk, and you're slowly moving from the more primitive, more biologically based needs and desires to higher and higher capacities. And when you get to the top, it's the highest power of soul of a citizen is the love of justice. And that is completing your nature. It's a squirrel needs an oak tree to eat the acorns and live in the trunk, hibernate in the trunk. Human beings need culture. They absolutely cannot exercise their capacities of soul without relating to people, without forming communities, and without forming communities that are based on the good life, not mere life. Okay, the point of, the other thing about the courts was that the gods gave us the capacity to know the difference between justice and injustice, to know good laws from bad laws, to understand the common good. So they gave us the power of choice and the responsibility to use our minds, to act on the basis of the love of wisdom. and then we suffer the consequences of our decisions. Um, so we're responsible for our choices. The gods gave us the capacity to understand. They gave us the message that we needed to seek wisdom. They gave us stories about why. The artists gave us stories about why we need to. But it's up to us to ultimately make the choice. Um, then there was a theater of Dionysus built into the side of the Acropolis, and that's very important because we can't, between our biological drives at the bottom of the Acropolis and our highest collective spiritual drive at the top, we have the theater where we learn what emotional obstacles, perversions, sicknesses we have to flush out of our psyches, how we ought to act and ought not to act in order to climb up to the top of the Acropolis and achieve that goal of being just. So obviously the theater is on the side of the Acropolis because it's halfway between our life as mere biological creatures and our life as flourishing, just, and wise adults. Okay. At the other side of the Acropolis is the Agora, the marketplace. And this is important also. There's a temple to Hephaestus, beautiful temple. It happens to have been preserved, one of the best preserved temples. Of course, everything was beautiful back when I lived, but okay, so Hephaestus was the craftsman. He was the god of the forge, so he worked with iron, metalworking, but he prevailed over the marketplace because the things that are sold there in the marketplace should be crafted. They should include thoughtfulness, a sense of beauty, and not because people do not live just to survive. They live for the good life. And Hephaestus was married to Aphrodite, and when they were married, that was a perfect union because Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and sensuality, gets married to, tied to, Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship, and you have a house that has beautifully crafted furniture, pottery, the building, and it's not ostentatious or gaudy or conspicuous consumption. It's just tasteful. It's just thoughtful. It goes beyond mere life. It's not a mere minimal dwelling. It's a celebration of the human spirit, the human drive for beauty, the human drive to develop itself, to add intelligence and thoughtfulness to every aspect of our lives, including the utensils we use to eat and things like that. So Hephaestus prevailed over the Agora. So it wasn't simply that you should be honest and don't cheat somebody at the marketplace, but you should sell things that are beautiful and well crafted, a high quality of goods. The other thing about the Agora was that the Athenians were cosmopolitan. They prided themselves on being tolerant and curious about other countries, other cultures, other city-states, other ethnicities. And so their navy, they had the best navy partly because they knew how to make ships, and they knew how to make ships for trade reasons. They had international trade. So the businessmen would go out because of Athens' cosmopolitan philosophy and their claim that they were universalists and tolerant and open-minded. They went out and found stuff from as far away as possible to come to the Agora and sell to people. And the idea there was that if you can create these trade agreements between city-states, they will not make war against each other. They will develop friendship bonds connected to the village, the economic sector. So that was the idea. And then also, very importantly, the people from the rural area would come into the marketplace because they had to come to buy the things they couldn't get at home. And right there, right next to where they were buying their stuff, the city had set up a huge public square with a whole lot of different things going on. First of all, the council of people who decided which issues would come before the assembly in what order. They met there, and then this was the media center. They would post what was going on in the assembly that day or that week, so that citizens from all over, rural and urban, would come and they would be informed, and then they would have other people right near them and they would be able to talk. So also they had the apartments where the rural people who were called into jury duty had to come and stay. They couldn't go home. So they had the apartments for the jurors there. And they also posted what jury trials were coming up. And they posted, I think, the results of the jury trials. So again, this was the media center, and it was all about their political system. And they're trying to get the people in the rural areas to come and learn about deliberation and to develop those capacities that Aristotle talks about. Understanding, good judgment, being able to assess other people's lives and decisions, cultivating the capacity to think about the art of legislation, good and bad legislation, distribution of wealth and social goods, rectification of wrongs, equity, how to apply laws in a given situation, the capacity for mercy, justice tempered with mercy, the good sense to forgive. And they would just talk about that, and that would be their way of developing the kind of insight that hopefully would enable them to make the right decision in the critical moment. Of course, as Aristotle says, everyone has good opinions, but because of their character, people do the right thing in the critical moment, or they don't because of strength or weakness of character. So this process of deliberation depends upon the strength of character of the people who come there to deliberate. But you can have really good intentions and a good character and still not have the intellectual training, education, dialogue, history of dialogue that enables you to develop good judgment. So character is necessary but not sufficient. The kind of deliberation that went on in the marketplace, necessary but not sufficient. It's very hard to get it right in the critical moment. But besides this media center, they also had a wonderful space, just a space for people to come and talk. And Socrates hung out there quite a bit. And they had 3 temples, a temple to Zeus, a temple to Athena, and a temple to Ares. Well, yeah. So while you're talking, hint, hint, the shadow of the god of justice will lord it over you. The shadow of the goddess, his daughter of justice and wisdom, will be there to remind you. And the shadow of Ares, The one who loves war for its own sake and who can get out of control very easily will also be a warning to you when it comes to some of the most serious questions a citizen has to decide whether to go to war, how, or as opposed to diplomacy or intelligence. When do you feel threatened? How threatened? How to preserve security, national security, without becoming the aggressor. When is it self-defense, and when is it um, provoking other people, creating animosity? So those three temples are there to constantly remind you. And when people are talking about war or other issues, they probably will refer to Zeus and Athena and Ares. Um, but we know from the tragedies and common sense that everybody in Agamemnon, for example, referred to Zeus, called upon Zeus, used Zeus to justify what they thought what they were doing. They thought they were just, but of course, any Athenian citizen who attends tragedies pretty regularly is going to know that just because you think it's the just thing doesn't mean it is. That's why you need to talk about it. That's why you need to also find out what people are doing, what other people have actually done, not just talked about. And then you talk about what other people have done. You can also talk about what the politicians are trying to convince you of. So again, the jurors have their apartments there, the ones from the rural areas, but right where they're living is 10 paces away from where the media outlet is, and 10 more paces away from the place where everybody's congregating to talk. So you have the marketplace of things and the marketplace of ideas. And I just thought, I thought this was amazing. Um, as Martha Beck, I was climbing up the Acropolis one of many times, and I really, it just blows me away every time I go there. But I was coming back down, and there was a family there that was coming down, and the wife said to the husband, "Honey, this is amazing." And I'm like, yes, that's how I feel about it. Every time I go there, it's like, this was amazing. And of course you can write a history about the corruption and the rot and the stink and everything, but first you have to understand how absolutely amazing what they created was and how it all fit together. It's just, you have to have that intuition of the whole and the parts in relationship to the whole, and just, it takes your breath away. And if your breath isn't taken away when you go there, there's something wrong with you. Anyway, besides that, besides the marketplace with all of its complexity and all of its incredible understanding of practical wisdom, and besides the theater, which also has all of this incredible insight about public education of the emotions and the practical judgment, and besides the courthouse on the top of the Acropolis, and also the Prinks in the hill next door is where the assembly met. It's Pryx. The assembly met on the hill right across from the Acropolis. So when they are making judgments about, this is where the jury trials were held, this is where the votes were taken, they had the temple to Athena and the Acropolis literally staring at them in the face. I mean, it just is extremely it's big. It's right there in front of them. So it's a constant reminder that they're supposed to act justly, that the eye of Athena is upon them when they make these judgments. So, and then the other thing about it, another layer of sort of taking your breath away, is that they had a tradition that was institutionalized for private symposia in people's homes. And of course, Plato's Symposium is one example. But there were certain rules. So, and the city encouraged people to sponsor or set up a symposia. Now, what it was is you agreed that you were going to find a serious question, spudaios, you were going to find something serious to talk about, something that would improve you as a person and as a citizen. So the city had a vested interest in people engaging in these kinds of conversations in their homes. Um, and the rule was everybody has to come together and make a body of laws that they will all follow and agree on. And in Plato's Symposium, they all agree that they're going to give a speech about love. But that's exactly, it's just following the general model, which, I don't know, most students, when they read it, they aren't told that this is part of a whole institutionalized system in Athens. Okay, so the other thing that's important about that is the process of having fellow citizens come together, decide that they're going to establish an institution, they're going to write some rules, and they're going to follow their rules, and everybody's subject to the rules equally, is just a mini example, a microcosm of the macrocosm of the city itself. And this, because the history of the city was that some citizens came together and they created a body of laws and they agreed to live under those laws. So it's a, children are born into political systems and they don't think about it. And sometimes, even as adults, they don't really think about what it means to live as citizens under a common body of laws. And the Athenians founders, the ones who created and sustained the institutions, wanted to be constantly reminding people that this is it. You live in a situation where somebody before you created these laws, and you must learn what it means to live together under a common body of laws. You have to continually change those laws, modify those laws, apply those laws, and pass on a legal system that's as good or better than the one you were given, that was passed down to you. This is your responsibility, not only as a citizen, but as a human being. You can't be fully human unless you are engaged. So there was the tradition of private symposia. There was also, at the bottom of the peninsula that Athens was on was a temple to Poseidon, the god of the sea. And that's another important. Poseidon is the one that should always remind people don't go to war too quickly, because we are subject to these natural forces. Human beings are very vulnerable, and in the face of either too much wind or too little wind, the god of the sea, we die. Poseidon can kill us off pretty easily. So that's a reminder that in our relationship to nature, we should not even try to overstep the bounds. And then Demeter. Okay, then there's also the Eleusinian fields are outside of Athens, and in the Panathenaeum, well, the Eleusinian fields are probably the oldest religious rites were conducted there, because they were tied with the goddess worship, which existed for many, many thousands of years before the patriarchy developed. So it was much older ceremony, and it was in the worshiping of Demeter and Persephone. So the worshiping of the goddess of fertility. And again, you don't wound the goddess of fertility, because she will come back to you and she will starve you out. So the cult of Demeter, west of Athens, and Poseidon, south of Athens, were these constant reminders about staying within the limits of nature, understanding your place in nature, and not overreaching. Don't commit hubris. Don't go too far, because nature will get you back and remind you constantly of your limits. Then every 4 years was the Pan-Athenaeum, which was a big religious festival where people started out in Delphi, a procession of the political leaders, some of the main aristocratic families, started out, and the priests in Delphi, which was the international center, and I had a video about Delphi, but it represented the union of the god of reason, but, as I said in my paper, that was Apollo, who was under the power of Athena. He was protected by Athena, and he was obedient to Athena. So reasoning is used for the purpose of justice. And also Apollo, this is the Apollo that allows for a Dionysus to take over, so an Apollo that doesn't repress emotions, that wants a balance of Dionysian energies and Apollonian energies. So the site at Delphi shows a whole lot of the gods and goddesses balancing out. And so it's a holistic vision, and it's an international vision. So the dignitaries start out in Delphi, and they go through the Eleusinian fields to honor fertility, to honor the earth, and then they come to Athens, which is the city that's supposed to be the most highly developed city. It's an affirmation of civitas, civilized life, but civilized life is simply human beings exercising their natural powers. Civilization is natural and necessary for human beings. Okay, so that was what was so amazing about our society. And in the next video, I'm going to explain, unfortunately, how we destroyed it all, which grieves me, but we did it. And I began a school, and I wrote my dialogues to explain to people, I knew people would look back. They would see the archaeological sites, they would study the history, and they would say, how did you lose that? Here you had this wonderful thing. How did you manage to lose a war, have social chaos, become so paranoid, so afraid, so desperate, that you elected a dictator? And so Plato, I started a school and wrote some dialogues that were like tragedies, in the sense that they said, don't do this. Here's how we destroyed our democracy. Don't do this. But they also include a path out of tragedy. So Plato's dialogues are partly tragic and partly beyond tragedy. But for now, in the next video, all I'm going to do is explain how we managed to destroy the whole thing and elect a dictator.